Okay, welcome. Welcome to our continuing Party Seminar Series. And he also manages the writing and publication of the California Latino Demographic Data Book. And this is why he is here today, basically to present the latest edition of this data book. Fred Guy has numerous publications in the area of text and document retrieval, social science information management, and information policy. He received his Ph.D. from UC Berkeley School of Information Management and Systems. And with that, I'll just turn it over to Fred. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm here, I guess you might wonder, what's an old white guy like me doing here talking about Latinos? And just, I guess I'm here representing the majority in a way. I mean, we're a minority in California, but we're still a majority in the rest of the United States. And I'm also an ethnic origin, or a national origin majority, because my heritage is German American, and they happen to be the largest national origin group in the United States. Probably not in California anymore. Well, first of all, I want to dedicate, I'm filming this for myself, to my bonus granddaughter, Gina Cisneros, who is out. She can't be here today because she's out attending high school at Deer Valley High School in Antioch, but I'll get her a copy of the tape. We've been doing this, let's see, several times, and so we can sort of answer why, and I can say a little bit about why I do this, because I've been working with census data for about 25 years. Gosh, it's been almost 30 years now. And one of the most interesting demographic things that's happened in California has been the growth of the Latino population. And you might say, why do we do a book? One of the reasons is, although there's a lot of data out there, you really have to dig if you want to find out and extract the information about Latinos from that data. They'll have data all over the place for all ethnic origin groups, for all states, and if you just want to get it about California, you have to dig it out and summarize it. So that's done in the summary files, which the Census Bureau puts together. And then, in addition, sometimes you won't find these on the Census Bureau website. You won't find the data you're looking for because they haven't actually summarized it. So if you want to know the median household income for Ecuadorians living in California, they don't publish that data because it'd just be too many national origin categories or racial categories that they'd have. But what they do is they put out a microdata file, which is a sample of those people, and I'll talk about that later. And so you can take those microdata files and actually run the summaries that you want. In addition to census of population, which they do every decade, they also have the economic censuses, which they do every 5 years, which talks about business ownership. And as part of that, they talk about minority business ownership. Then a third source of data is the INS immigration figures. INS puts out data files about legal immigration that you can get hold of and do your own tabulation. In addition, there's data from the Department of Finance and Education on educational attendance in California, and from the Department of Social Services on public assistance usage in California by race and ethnicity. And the other thing is that it really helps for people to see a graph. And as I said, we've done it before, and a lot has changed since 1990. So here, for example, is one of our maps in the growth in percent Latino. Now, all of our text says Latino all of our charts say Hispanic and our tables say Hispanic, and that's because that's the official term used by the Census Bureau, which is that people are asked if they were of Hispanic origin, and then what kind of flavor of Hispanic origin.
Now this chart actually means that, let's say, I think that's Imperial County, it's the percent of the population that was Latino in Imperial County increased by 8% or more. Mm-hmm. No counties declined, apparently. Mm-hmm. So it went from, say, 22% to 30%, or in this case, more like 42% to 50%.
Actually, more like 60% to 72%.
Wow.
For a period of time. So, what do we have? We have where they live, where people live, where they come from, and their citizenship status. Like this is percent Central American by county. You notice the scale is quite different from the total percentages. Let me back up here. Here's the percent Latino. It turns out 2 counties have more than 50%. I know Imperial County is 72% according to the 1990 census. And I'm actually not sure which county that is. Is that Tulare? No, this is, I know this is Kern County because I grew up here right on the border of Kern County. Let's see, I guess it's on the border of Kern and San Bernardino. So this is probably Fresno, right? So,
good thing we don't have to get our high school equivalency. California geography.
Actually, I know the county is sort of around the north and on the sides, but I don't know. I mean, having grown up in Eastern California, I know all the Eastern Sierra counties. But anyway, so what do we have? 7 chapters on various different subjects. The more chapters we have, I mean, the more information we have, the larger the size of the chapters. So there's a lot of information on population, some information about age, sex, and household characteristics, a lot of information about employment and occupation, a fair bit of information on employment poverty, and not a whole lot of information about political participation and citizenship.
And household, would that include health?
You know, we really haven't put very much emphasis on
information?
health. I don't think we have any health information in this book. And in fact, we have it in as a kind of a demographic book. I guess we've given short shrift to health. We have information on medical participation and eligibility.
You could do that from the California Health Energy Survey. 50,000 households, I think.
Yeah. It's just enough to grab our hands around the other stuff. But health would be a good thing to approach next, I think. So who did this? Actually, most of the work was done by Cecilia Jane, who's graduated now. She got her MA at School of Information Management and Systems in June. And John Stiles, who's our archivist and our map expert, helped Cecilia learn SPSS and do the maps. And Alona, my colleague, has been madly proofreading. We're going to come out with a new version, but it won't change the tables very much. It will just fix up all the incorrect headers and footers and put all the sources. And I'm just a front hand. That is, I get to do the presentations, and I actually go out and raise the money. And we got the money from UC Nexus and California Policy Research Center, and it didn't cover all our personnel costs, so we've thrown in a whole bunch of our own time too. Good grief. Oh, I guess this, it's hard to read this italics. But anyway, so some of the things, chapter by chapter, I'll go through them a little bit. And then I've got about 20 slides, and then when I'm done, I can go and open up each chapter and we can look at it in a little more detail. So basically, the population, that's one of the great interesting things. They expected that the population, the Latino population, in 1990 the projection was the Latino population would be less than 30%. It was 25% in 1990, it'd be less than 30% by 2000. In fact, it was almost 1/3, it was almost 33%. So there are these projections, but they've been consistently underestimating the actual growth of the Latino population. California Latinos, well, Latinos fall in distinct groups. If you're in New York, most of the New York Latinos are Puerto Ricans. If you're in Florida, most of the Latino population is Cuban. If you're in Texas, most of it's from Mexico. But when you get to California, it's quite diverse, but primarily Mexican origin and Central American origin. And particularly Central American origin, I would say, because of the oppression of Central America during the Reagan years. Just lots and lots of people came here, they formed communities, and those communities expanded. We have a lot of geographic detail. As I said, Imperial County is now 72%. We've got a listing in Chapter 2, 189 cities that had greater than 50% Latino population. And here's the 28 ordered by percent Latino that have greater than 90%. And a few of them are quite big. I might explain that CDP means census designated place. If there's a community that's basically urban, but it's not an incorporated city, the Census Bureau says that we call this the equivalent of a city, and we call it a census designated place, and we will tabulate information for it. And they do that for towns as small as 200 or 300. So, you know, I recognize some of these, but Heber, I don't recognize. And who would have thought that Mecca, California would be 98% Latino?
I've been. That's where I'm from. I'm from Coachella, but I mean, that whole area is sort of agricultural area.
So Mecca is near...
Mecca is near Coachella, yeah.
Yeah, I know where Coachella is. That's Imperial, right?
Mecca is actually still in Riverside County, and you go a little bit south of that towards the Salton Sea and you get into Imperial.
Yeah. A lot of these places are in the Los Angeles area.
Yeah, Los Angeles County.
I don't see any of them that are up in this area. But there are definitely some in this area that are over the 50% line. So the population is substantially younger than the non-Latino population. For those of you who may not have encountered this, this is what's known as a population pyramid. It basically counts males on the left and females on the right, and gives you a percent of the total population that's either male or female in 5-year age groups, starting from 0 to 4, 5 to 9, up at the top, it's 75 years and older. And so you can see the wave of the future is Latino because they're all young, and the non-Hispanic whites have quite a bulge up there at the top, especially with women who outlast men. In addition, their households are larger. This is a graph of household size. So let's see, down there at the bottom we have this figure that says, you know, 1-person households, 2-person households, 3-person households, up to 7-person households. Well, the Latino population has about 15% of them live in 7-person households. More than 50% live in, about 75%, I'd say, at least of Mexican origin, live in 3 or more person households. As opposed to white alone, where more than 50% live in 1 or 2-person households. And in fact, the black population is beginning to look like the white population. The Asian population, because of this immigration from Asia in the last 20 years, or the last 30 years, and because they also have larger families, looks more like the Latino population. We've done an Asian demographic data book, but haven't pursued doing a second version of that.
In the non-Hispanic line, that's sort of everybody who's not Hispanic?
That's all of these combined.
Got it.
Well, actually, it's more than all of these, because in year 2000, which I haven't put on my slides, they asked you whether you were white alone or white in combination with some other races. Black alone, black in combination, Asian alone, Asian in combination. And so it not only includes all of these, but everything else in the multiple race category that's not Hispanic. So the other characteristic is that basically the Latino population is bilingual. They pretty much speak this category of speaking English well or very well, even though it's not your primary language, is more than 50% of the population. However, we also have this broken down by
generation,
by arrival time. In other words, from 1990 to 2000, and that's a different matter. It turns out that of that group, a large proportion don't speak English well or not at all.
Do you have second or third generation?
No, there's no identification of generation.
Okay.
There's identification of whether you were native born, whether you entered pre 1980 to 1989, or 1990 to 1990. Or maybe it's 1991 to 2000, I'm not exactly sure. Those are the questions that were asked. The educational attainment lags that of non-Latinos and even of blacks. Here's the graduation rate or percent who have graduated of those who are 22 to 34 by the origins. Most of this is heavily weighted by the Mexican population, Mexican origin population, which makes up the majority of the California Latino population. Puerto Ricans, Cubans, other Hispanics, and South Americans are basically essentially higher income, upper middle class professionals who have decided to migrate to California for one reason or another. I mean, a good example would be Carlos Delgado, who runs the Chicano Latino Library over there. They're a very small minority of the California population, and they tend to look more like the upper middle class. And similarly, South American immigrants tend to be highly educated, basically professionals. So I think in the education realm, everybody realizes that a lot more needs to be done in California. Latino men have basically unemployment rates that are 50% higher than non-Latino. These are 1999 figures, so they're basically at the height of the California economic boom. So the unemployment percent is down here at the very small layer. This is the employment and blacks actually have, black males have a substantially higher unemployment rate than Latinos.
And then, not in labor force?
Yeah.
Any consideration of age?
We have age figures in the book themselves, but this would be total.
Who's not in the labor force?
Prison?
Who would be not in the labor force?
Well, yeah, anybody who is not working or not actively looking for work. So it could be either people who are disabled, people who are in prison, people who
military?
Military. Well, military, I'm not sure.
Okay.
No, military, I think, is considered employed.
So-called discouraged workers.
But discouraged workers, basically people who've given up looking for work. So, in fact, if you have a recession, and then toward the end of the recession, the unemployment rate goes up, it turns out that's because the discouraged workers go back into the labor force and they're unemployed, but they're actively looking for work. So this is a distribution of Latino, non-Latino by broad occupational category, and why I say that 5 more times more likely to be working in agricultural occupations is because here's the non-Latino agricultural sector, and here's the Latino participation in it. It's about 1% for non-Latinos.
So the red bars and the blue bars separately would add to like 100% if you had all.
Yeah. There's been a market increase in these figures are 7 years old, the 1997, because the 2002 economic censuses probably don't have the information out that's detailed on. When they do an economic census, one of the last things they do is a survey of minority-owned businesses, and then they put out a whole bunch of statistics on minority-owned business by which you could get this kind of information. So here are the percent of all California businesses owned by Latinos, and here are the receipts. You can see the receipts are going down as a percent of the total, but that may be because there are a whole lot of small firms who aren't making a lot of money. And the other thing that we have in the book, but not in this chart, is that there Latino-owned businesses in California are about 28% of all Latino-owned businesses in the United States. This breaks out median household income, median family income, and then per capita income for each one of these groups. A per capita income basically divides the total income by the total number of people. So if you have large families with children who are non-earners, your per capita income is going to be lower than small families with multiple earners, which is usually the case for whites and Asians. This is sources of income for these categories, Hispanic versus non-Hispanic. Non-Hispanic is broken out, and the Hispanic is broken out. And these are particular categories of, it's not all income types, but whether people are self-employed, that is, they own their own business, whether they have Social Security income. You can see that whites have a 30%, almost 30% of whites in California have Social Security income, whereas less than 15% of Latinos do. Now, here's another factor. Probably the Cuban population is quite a bit older, because most of them, they even have a higher rate of Social Security income than whites. And then public assistance income. So blacks have a higher public assistance participation rate than Latinos, but Latinos are higher than whites or Asians. Poverty rates, percent of people below the poverty line. I mean, this is an interesting figure that I never see politicians actually make into something. That is, what does it mean when, I mean, if you really wanted to say this, here's 20% of blacks and 20% of Hispanics live below the poverty line. And in fact, when you break this out by age, it's even more stark. Basically in California, you find among Latinos and among blacks, every fourth child you meet is probably getting some form of public assistance. And I'm surprised that the liberal politicians don't really take that up. And then finally we have voting participation. The percent of voters in 1980 was about, I don't know, 7%, 6.6%. And by the year 2000 election and Clinton election, there were 13.5% of the electorate. Now, the reasons why Latinos have a smaller share of the electorate than a lot of other groups is basically the citizenship. In other words, they form 25% of adult citizens, of adults, but only about 17% of adult citizens, and then of those 17%, they're the ones who are really legally eligible to register and vote. And that's about half the percentage of the California Latino population. So in fact, a whole lot of these figures connected with income, connected with political participation, connected with educational attainment, have to do with citizenship and immigration.
This is a percentage of the total, right?
Pardon?
The Hispanic share of the total.
Yeah, the total.
Yeah.
Of the total voting population, of the total adult population, of the total citizen population.
So why does 96 look so funky? I mean, it looks like overestimation of 96. Or we had some immigration trend between 96 and 2000 that we don't quite understand.
Yeah, let me try to back up real quick and see if I can do a little bit of explaining from that in this particular figure. This is the percent of California legal immigrants, the fraction of California legal immigrants admitted from Mexico, El Salvador, and South America. And basically, in the 70s, they accounted for about almost 40% of all California immigration. By the late 80s, they accounted for less than 20%, almost as low as 15%. And then with IRCA, which legalized a whole bunch of people who had been here before, these people, in my opinion, have been basically bringing their families forward. And so the fraction of Latino immigration from Mexico has gone back up to where it's almost 35% from the period 1997 to 2001. So when we think about this participation, their share of the adult population, I think this wave hasn't quite hit. In other words,
There was also massive voter citizenship in 95,
Yeah.
96.
Right,
but we still get
the mystery is
define-
the adult citizen.
What's actually happening here is a demographic trend. The Latino population is getting younger and younger. A lot of these immigrants are children who are coming in, their relatives who bring children, and there's been a whole lot of births to the young adult Latino population in California. So that's pushed the fraction of Latinos that are adults down. I mean, that's my opinion.
Or we've had rapid growth in the population, but not rapid growth in the adult population.
Yeah, I mean, that's basically what I'm saying. I mean, I don't have the figures, but I think that I looked at it not long ago, that over 50% of babies born in California now are Latino. So let me...
Couldn't we get some of those folks to move to Ohio for a week or two?
Great.
That would be a great idea. I mean, in fact, just this move from 6.5% to 13%, and it's probably going to be around 15% or more in the 2004 election, has had a tremendous impact on the California political scene. I mean, David spent a lot of time in Texas. I didn't quite understand why Texas is 60% for Bush against Kerry, but in California, in 94, there was this wedge issue called Proposition 187 that for the first time really galvanized the Latino political action. And until Schwarzenegger was elected, basically I think it's been the major contributing factor in making California such a democratic stronghold. It was one of these things that it won in an election, but at a long-term political cost, which I think is still going to show up this election, this Tuesday. So since we've got all the data bonks here, I'm going to talk about the sources for a few minutes. For the 2000 census, we've got these summary files on the web, but it's really difficult to extract the Latino information for California. You do a lot of cutting and pasting if you want to get this stuff out. The one thing about the census is it doesn't ask whether your residency is legal or not. And I personally know people who are undocumented who have filled out the census. So it, as opposed to the INS figures, which count legal immigration, the Census Bureau is actually counting some fraction of the undocumented population. The figures that they have on the web are not adjusted at for undercount, which was estimated to be about 500,000, or about 1.5% of the California population in the year 2000.
Was that the undercount of Latinos or the whole California?
The whole California population.
But we suspect
a larger fraction of Latinos were undercounted than the rest of the population.
I'm just wondering how, if they don't ask whether residency is legal or not, how do they separate the non-citizen from the citizen in the early years?
They do ask the question as to whether you're a citizen.
Oh, okay. All
So
right.
it would include the legal permanent.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So yeah. Then for those items for which We don't have any summary files that have been pre-tabulated by the Bureau for you and put out on the web or on CD-ROM. They put out this public use microdata sample, and it's 1% and 5%. First of all, they put out 1%, that is 1 in 100 of these census forms that are filled out essentially gets put out in an electronic form with all the identifying information scrubbed away. And it's very useful when we don't have summary tables. There are whole chapters in this that are almost were tabulated by us from the microdata samples. And however, they're unreliable when the underlying population is small. In other words, I can go maybe spend a little time on one of these chapters and talk about how many Ecuadorian families and people we have in California, which is not very many. And then we've used for the political stuff the current population survey, which comes out every 2 years. They're going to take it at the end of November. And it's a random sample of the 48,000 U.S. households. So if they've stratified the sample, they stratify it by sampling areas, and they certainly cover California pretty well. And California is about 12% of the U.S. population, so you figure that would be about 6,000 families. So when you get down to some of the details, that would be somewhat unreliable too. The race ethnicity questions pretty much parallel the census questions. However, they don't go into national origin detail. In other words, they'll do Mexican, Central American, South American, but they aren't going to do Ecuador and Venezuela and whatever. There are extra questions. The current population survey is actually taken usually 10 to 12 times a year, and it's kind of a byproduct of the unemployment and employment figures. It's paid for by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The Census Bureau actually goes out and does the work, and the bottom line is these monthly employment and unemployment figures that come out. But they ask a lot of questions. In March, they asked what they call the annual demographic file, which is sort of a mini census for the same population. And then these extra questions that are taken every other November are asked only of persons 18 years and older.
But it's not broken down. It's whomever the random sample, it's not broken between citizen and non-citizen, just adults. On the voting?
You know, I'm not sure.
That would make a difference, right? It would be interesting to...
We'll pull up the chapter. I mean, if all these people have read the chapter, they'll know whether I've got some breakouts by citizenship, non-citizenship, which I think I did.
And the other question is if whether you think, in your opinion, that the CPS in terms of voting has a sufficient number of sample of Latinos for it to be a useful guide in terms of how Latinos voted.
That's a really good question. And the answer is, I'd say, overall, it's probably enough. When you try to break it down, I'm not sure. If you figure there'd be 6,000 California households, 25% of them are Latino.
Sample of 1,000 might
So it's a sample that's more than 1,000, which is certainly enough for a reasonable thing. I mean, the problem with both of these files is everything is self-identification, everything is voluntary. You assume that people are honest when they're filling out these forms. It's probably more honest when they're actually sitting there with somebody with their laptop from the census asking them a question in their household. And if it's, let's say, Kathy Hernandez out in Antioch answering that question, she isn't going to say that she's of Danish origin. But since the Census Bureau is a mail-in questionnaire, and anybody can say anything, they can fill it out any way. I could say that I was 18 years old and I'm black. So this self-identification may have its limits. I believe that the Bureau does some kind of quality control for this. But, you know, the nice thing about Americans is in general they're honest.
Well, they might be honest, but oftentimes they don't know what's being asked. I mean,
That's true.
One of the problems with the, recall one of the census, recent censuses, is that they asked the number of people living in the South to self-identify themselves, and they marked off South American. I mean, you know, all of a sudden you had 25% of the people living in the South were South American.
Yeah.
Well, you know, there's some problems there. Self-identification.
Yeah. Well, that's happened before, and probably happened in the 2000 census too, where a lot of people who were Latino identified themselves as other race. And so the other race category was a bulge that people hadn't expected in the 1990 census. So let's see. Here's the chapter 1. I should have handed this out at the beginning, but here's my handout. This is the chapter 1 introduction. The other thing we've done is do some work with administrative data. The INS, which is now called, I don't know, the Department of Bureau of something in the Department of Homeland Security, basically creates a data file every year on all people who are admitted to a permanent residence during the fiscal year. And that was this 850,000 some during the federal fiscal year, which is October through September. And they put out this file and they show the country of origin and the intended state of residence. The state of California has Medi-Cal eligibility files. I'm unclear whether they put out a public use file. We have an advantage that we get some of these confidential files for work that we do directly for the Department of Social Services. And so here's a file that had almost 6 million people in July 2002, and the race ethnicity here is generally determined by the eligibility intake worker as opposed to self-identification. And we would have the county of residence. So how do you access it? My preferred way would be to say go to UC Berkeley.edu, go down to here to where it says projects and choose that, and then choose Latino Demographic Data Book 3rd edition, because we're going to make some changes to the web page and probably put in a new web page pretty soon. We've done a lot of revision and correction and proofreading of these files in the last couple of months, and that'll go up in the next week or two. But the numbers are not going to be that different from what you've already downloaded if you've done it. It's just that it'll be much more accurate as to exactly where the source was for each individual table.
Now, do you do any extrapolations, or do you just basically collect the data from different sources and put it together?
That's basically what we do.
Okay.
So,
but could I use your data book to do extrapolations? I mean, for example, say I'm interested in estimating the illegal immigrant population in California, and you have the stats of legal migration from INS, and then you also have the census stuff about non-citizens. Could I fool around?
Yeah, you probably could. You should probably get in touch with Hans Johnson at the Public Policy Institute of California, because he wrote an estimation. He wrote a book. He wrote a little pamphlet for them a few years back on estimating the undocumented population in California,
Okay.
and methodologies that he used to.
All right.
He's sort of the chief demographer. He came from California Department of Finance, where he did the same thing. He's essentially the chief demographer over the public policy. In fact, you should probably invite him over here for the talk.
Okay.
That'd probably be a good idea.
We just,
Yeah, just like.
So let's see now. What is chapter 2? Let's see if I'm going to bring up a few of these chapters and just go into a little more detail in an ad hoc way as to their contents. So the new version that will go up will have a 2 or 3 page introduction to each chapter, which I've been writing in the last couple of weeks. But anyway, basically what we have is a very detailed table for each of these populations. And then they'll generally be followed by a couple of charts. So this was the one that I used as the main one, and here's one that breaks down the Latino population into its constituent origin. So Mexican origin really dominates California, Latino population, but there's a significant South American, and then other Hispanic is kind of a catch-all, and it probably includes those people who really don't know how to fill out the form.
I'm surprised that Central American environment find it even much larger. Others.
Yeah, I would have too, but you have to remember that the Mexican population, the Mexican origin population, includes all those people who are native born here, who are third, fourth generation, etc., in addition to the new immigrants. And there's been a lot of new immigration from Mexico, and I think the Central American immigration has been tailing off for the last decade.
Yeah.
So in addition to California maps, we've also done some U.S. maps. So that's, the display isn't coming out very well. I think this has something, I don't know whether this is my my laptop display falling out, but basically the maps are pretty nice. You know, we have here the percent Hispanic, but the real numbers, if you want to know where they really, where the density of concentration is the numbers. And the numbers basically are very, very large numbers. These are counties with more than 50,000 Hispanics, people of Hispanic origin living in. And you can see they concentrate in California and certain areas of Texas and around the Arizona border, in certain places in Florida, and of course Chicago, and the metropolitan areas in the Northeast.
Now, would it be if I was interested in doing mapping of, say, the Bay Area?
Yeah.
You know, and would I be able to do that using your data book?
Yep. Let me go down a little. We've got these growth figures on the U.S. too, but I want to get to some of these other maps. I'll just try to move down a little, because in fact we have census tract maps for the metropolitan areas of California. We have a little bit of a problem with these map boundary files. Los Angeles is fine, but
are those census tracts?
Yeah, these are census tracts. But when we get to the Bay Area, the boundary files,
a little hard.
were a little bit hard to read, and the problem is that we couldn't get clean boundary files. We've got these boundary files from a statewide database right across the street there in the Paros Hall, and they've got so much detail in the boundary of every little lake and pond and stuff like that, that it's very difficult. Let's see if I can zoom in here and even get anything better. It's kind of hard to see, even the more you zoom in. So one of the nice things about having a book on the web is if you find some better boundary files, I can go ahead and redo the map and whoops. And still got to zoom back out if I'm going to go further. So anything that has multiple counties, the maps don't show up all that well. They give you a fair idea of the outlying areas and some of the densities, but it could be better. Now let's see, I wanted to talk a little bit about the citizenship. Let's move this up to 100%. Oh yeah, here's projected populations, and you can get multiple projected populations. These are generally done annually by the California Department of Finance and also the Bureau of the Census. And you can take a look at these various series and compare for the whole United States and also for California. I mean, as I say, they've consistently underestimated the growth of the California Latino population, partly because they think that actually it's going to tail off and they'll begin to look more like the rest of the population, so they won't have quite as many big families, and the birth rate will begin to decline, and so it'll begin to flatten out over time.
Yeah, I had a meeting with Hans Johnson today, the migration working group on the TPIC today to talk about. And they did an interesting study, he and Belinda Reyes, where they actually showed that for immigrant Latina women, the fertility rate has actually declined. And it's actually closer to US-born women, and that's declined over the years. So there may in fact be some truth to this notion about the population sort of slow down over time, for immigrants anyways.
Yeah, well, I have two personal examples. Young Latino women whom I know. One who was a high school graduate from Mexico who came here. She had 2 kids. Another one who was almost born here but came when she was 2 and didn't get a high school degree, and she's got 4 kids. So I think education and people see the economic advantage of smaller families, although they like the personal advantage of large families.
Does the California Department of Finance report taxes paid by various populations? Estimates, anything like that?
Let's say they have the information. You really have to...
They have income tax.
Yeah, they'd have state income tax. If you wanted to do that, it would be an interesting project. You know, we also manage this Census Research Data Center here on campus, which allows you to have access to the individual files, and you can match by name. And I believe there's also some ability to access the IRS returns. I'm not exactly sure. I mean, basically, you have to go to a site that's locked, that's monitored all the time.
Yeah.
You do the work there, you can't take anything away, you can take your results after they've been reviewed by a Census Bureau employee.
And you have to be affiliated with the universities?
No, you can propose anything you want.
As a research project.
As a
not just
research
some
project,
Joe
however,
walking
it
in.
goes through a really rigorous review process. In other words, the Census Bureau has a veto power on what exactly they're going to do or not do. And there's essentially an independent academic review and then a review by Census Bureau, the Census Bureau unit that manages this, and they have to see that there's a Census Bureau interest in this too.
But could you design a different, without going to the Census Research Center, potentially playing around with, let's see, labor force participation, percentage of working adults, Latino, match it against tax revenues? I mean, you could probably come up with a formula, right, of some type.
Yeah, but the Census Bureau doesn't ask you what your Social Security number is. So, all these Jim Smiths, I mean, I don't know if they might be able to do an address match and see what.
But if you were trying to,
clear.
if you were trying to get some answers to some questions like, what Latinos in the state of California are contributing to the state tax? Okay.
And how much?
Yeah, and how much versus how much is getting invested in their communities vis-a-vis public schools or infrastructure. You wouldn't necessarily need address. You could think of some interesting questions to try to play around
but
with.
I mean, that's the other problem is that and when you file your tax return, they don't ask you what your ethnicity is.
Right.
So it would be a massive problem.
Yeah, it would be fun. Let me see if I I'm trying to look at this. Okay, here's a good table of population figures. And in fact, the historical population, which goes from 7.2% in 1950 to 32.4, nearly one-third in 2000, has some interesting antecedents. In other words, they didn't ask whether you were Spanish origin until the 1970 census. So the 1950 and 60 census are inferred by going back and recoding Spanish surnames. And so how accurate that is, there is a kind of a way of doing that because, in fact, they did ask it in let me get this back to zoom out. Oops, I'm still on zoom in.
Zoom in, we want to zoom in.
Oh yeah, you're right, I want to zoom in. Okay. You can see that in 1970, they actually did both. They went back and recoded the Spanish surnames, and they also asked the self-identification. So you have a kind of a benchmark for that one census of how accurate the Spanish surname is, and it's very good because it shows that, as you would expect, it underestimates the
But not by much.
population,
Yeah.
but not a whole lot.
Yeah.
So let's pretty interesting.
You know, Fred, do you know if there's been any work done on the impact of Spanish surname and then self-identification among Filipinos in the Filipino community?
No. Now, I don't know about it. I didn't remember about 2000, but when we did the Pacific Rim Asian Demographic Data Book, I was really surprised to find that the largest Asian population in California was Filipino, larger than Chinese.
This big agricultural workforce.
So let's see if there's another. Let me bring up. Chapter 7. So, you know, essentially by looking at this, you can see how the citizenship plays out in the Hispanic population. Basically, almost all whites are citizens. And almost all blacks are citizens, and Asians have a smaller percent. Let's see, maybe I'm looking at the wrong table. Yeah, this is what I was looking at this before. Basically, of the voting population, 70% are white, but they represent 45% of the population. Latinos are less than half of their representation in the population. Blacks are about the same, so are others. Asians underrepresent their representation in the population.
But isn't that partly due to the youth also?
Yeah.
Right? So, I mean, you can't...
Asian youth is also a factor.
And age. The white...
The whites are older.
You can
They're
vote
more-
if you're older.
In fact, when you look at it, once you register,
Well, it seems like
once people register,
yeah, they tend to vote.
most of them vote. In other words, yeah, 14% of them are registered, and 13.9% of them actually vote.
Yeah.
Their voter participation is about the same as, let's see, I think we have a voter turnout. So if you're registered, you have an 84% probability of actually going to the polls, which is comparable to blacks and Asians. And, only 5% are whites. So I guess the big answer is go out and register all those people who can vote.
But you're 20% not registered, or a little over 20%.
Well, only half of the adult citizens are registered according to that, right? 53%, is that right?
Well, let's see, 64% is here.
Oh,
So 60% as opposed to 80%
Right.
of whites,
okay.
and 77% of blacks, and
Right.
60, Asians and Latinos are about comparable. But if in fact you could get this, if you could get this proportion up to 80%, it would constitute quite an increased voting bloc.
Yeah.
And who knows what it's going to be in the 2004 election. I mean, I'll be very interested to see what the figures are. And then, in addition, there may be an overestimation too. In other words, remember, these are questions that people answer voluntarily. And maybe they don't want to say, oh, I never bothered to register, or I never bothered to vote. So I would suspect that they probably underestimate the true registration and true voting.
Underestimate or overestimate?
They overestimate. Excuse me. They overestimate. I mean, I think, and of course, they'll never ask you who you voted for. So if you really want to get those figures, what you want to do is get the exit polls from the media.
They didn't have any in 2000.
Wouldn't this be old? Well, no, maybe they did in 1996.
Well, DNS, that's the one that most people go to.
Yeah, yeah.
Again, this is something that would be an interesting project if you wanted to compare those that say they voted with the actual. I mean, we know how many people voted.
Yeah.
I mean, add the number of people who voted, and then compare it with those who say they voted.
Yeah.
And come up with
A number that you could then use to.
right.
Yeah. Yeah.
In Texas, we have the opposite problem, where more people vote than say they voted.
Must be those cemeteries.
It's those cemeteries, yeah, you know.
If anybody watched Cokie Roberts being interviewed during the last election round, where they asked, "Are you shocked by these allegations of voter corruption?" She said, "I grew up in New Orleans, where they say we bury our dead above ground so they could get to the coals faster."
The new voting machines, you know. There was one case where 20,000 people were supposed to vote, and the voting machine said 100 and some thousand people.
What state?
I still think the Midwest, I forgot what it was. It was on NPR last week.
I have my stock political joke, which always comes back because I was able to use it in 1968 when, or 1962 when Daley Sr. was mayor of Chicago, and the joke goes sort of like this. The updated joke: Mayor Daley, President Bush, and Colin Powell are out on the mayor's yacht on Lake Michigan, and a huge storm comes up and overturns the yacht, and so they end up in a lifeboat together, and the lifeboat starts sinking. They realize that if two people, there's only enough time for one person to survive, the other two have to jump out. So they argue among themselves as to who's the most important and who should stay alive. And finally, Mayor Daley says, "Let's do it the Democratic way, let's take a vote." And Daley wins 8-2. So basically, we've done a lot of work trying to break out a lot of these figures by citizenship and whether people were foreign-born, have become citizens, and register and vote from these kinds of files. And we've done that throughout the book, try to break things out by year of entry and whether people are citizens or non-citizens. In this case, the people who register and vote would only be citizens, but in most of the other tables, they get rather complex because we break them out by citizenship and non-citizenship.
But those tables, what they tell you is that over 50% of the foreign-born Hispanics, let's see, or I guess 60% of the foreign-born adult citizens are voting. Is that right?
Well, first of all, yeah.
I was looking at the top one.
The top one.
Right there.
Okay. Foreign-born, 61% have registered.
Okay.
Versus 65% of the native born.
Okay.
and of the non-Hispanic, the native-born 80%, and of the foreign-born 67%. So it's actually not that different from foreign-born Hispanic. And then of the citizens, let's see, percent registered. I'm trying to figure out what this is. Oh, percent of adults and percent of adult citizens. But that should be different. Adults.
You can only register if you are a citizen.
Yeah. Okay. Adult citizens are only 50% of the adult population. In other words, this is essentially the universe from which this comes. In other words, the Latino population, the native Latino population, no, the native Latino has to be adult citizens. And only 50%, 53% if they register.
Of native-born Latinos who are citizens and adults, only 53% are
And then
registered.
53% or 52.9% voted.
Oh yeah, these are voted. These are
Voted.
voted. I think we've got to put a line in here that makes
Yes.
it clear.
Okay, right, so.
This is the voted.
Yeah.
In other words,
Okay.
of those who are eligible to vote, 53% actually voted. Similarly with foreign-born citizens, whereas the non-Hispanics it's 70%, and the foreign-born is foreign-born citizens.
So the gap is more
So there's still
substantial
quite a
among
gap.
the native-born.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And so the top line in the adult citizens percent voting, what that means is of the percent registered to vote, 65% of the native voted and 61% of the foreign born voted.
No. What it means is that 65% of the native adult citizens actually registered,
Okay,
but only 53% of the native adult citizens actually voted.
right.
So the universe, what we call is the eligible California population, which means adult citizens.
So the trend, that Latinos register at lower numbers and turn out to vote at lower numbers
Yeah.
continues to hold true. Because you had a different graph earlier on where
Well-
they talked, if they register, they vote.
The gap is greater in registration behavior than it is in voting behavior, but there still is some gap in voting behavior.
Yeah, I think the main gap is that of voting behavior. If we look at this 65% ought to be correspond to another figure that was back in another table.
This would be great fun.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's,
Looking at these.
yeah, this is good.
Yeah, 64.2%. Oops. 64.2% are registered. And that corresponds essentially to the other figure.
Right, and then you have that 53% right there voting,
Yeah.
adult citizens voting. So basically there's an 11% drop between registration and voting. Adult citizens.
Yeah.
You've mentioned that you've done studies on various communities. I'm wondering if you use the same indicators across the board, or are there indicators that are particular to the Latino community that people have questions about, or that are more, does that make sense? Whether it be labor, immigration,
Let me see if I can.
statistics.
I think the basic thing that we have is essentially the same information but for particular, we've got a lot of maps by county. Maybe it's chapter 6 that has some of this information. I'm trying to find a table for this. Well, I mean, here's just the listing of places, and all you have is the percent Latino, and then the total Mexican origin, Central American origin, South American origin, and other Latino. Now, I think we have some detail by metropolitan area from chapter 6. No, I think it's actually chapter 5. Here's an example of the kinds of things that we break out. Year of entry by citizen, non-citizen, and employment, unemployment, labor force. Trying to get some of these community things, which I think were more in the industry area. There's the industry, and then I was talking about the, and then broken out by year of entry and citizenship. But I thought that we had some information by metropolitan area as well. I think maybe it's only for Latino-owned businesses. In other words, percent of firms owned by industrial sector and metropolitan area. In other words, California total, and then the Los Angeles area, the Sacramento area, San Diego, etc. I was trying to look for the one that was Fresno, because there was a very interesting figure out of Fresno. Yeah, here, Fresno. And in general, Latinos are kind of underrepresented in firms in California, but there's a mistake there. How can it say that 60% in agriculture, but how can this say 137%? I just found a mistake here. So
is that right? 60% of firms, agricultural firms, are owned by Hispanics?
Yeah, but I thought it should be, yeah. But I thought it was more like, I had seen one that was 90%.
They must be,
I mean, agricultural sector includes farming, forestry, fisheries, but also agricultural services, like people who sell tractors and things like that.
Or would it count like farm labor contractors?
Probably.
Gotcha.
I would think so.
Oh, see, otherwise the number
Yeah,
doesn't make
yeah,
sense.
you're right, you're right. It could be. Anyway, when we put this up, we're going to ask people to tell us if you find errors in it.
Like at 137.
That's very peculiar to me. It probably what happened is we do these runs and we do some cutting and pasting to actually create the data. So somebody made a mistake in doing that. So, any other questions? I hope I am. I actually, we don't have a lot of detailed information about particular communities. You can't get it from the samples because the samples won't have enough people in them. The public use microdata samples basically will not identify a geography that's less than 100,000 in population. So in fact, if you want to have some sample data about Northern California, the top northern counties, they'll put Del Norte, Siskiyou, Modoc, and Lassen counties together and say that's one group, and we'll give you statistics about those groups of counties, but not about the individual counties. For example, you get a 5% sample for Oakland and for Berkeley and Albany and Emeryville combined. If you're interested in rent control, it's kind of difficult to study it from the census. But there is a fair bit of information on the Census Bureau website that's put out by the community. In other words, they'll probably have the unemployment and employment rate for very small towns.
You have home ownership and things like that.
Yeah, home ownership would probably be broken down into Yeah, we don't have very much on the housing side either. It's mostly the population side. Anything else?
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.